So I don't know where to start because there is a lot that we can talk about. Um, I don't because I've got my set of things to talk about. You got yours. If you want to
Yeah.
go with yours first, we can just like direct around from there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's interesting talking about communication in, free and open source projects. There's multiple aspects to it. There's communication within your project, which in some ways is easier because communities develop and they kind of naturally grow into certain norms. And so when you're within your project, you're kind of in the in group, right? Like
Mhm.
there still absolutely can be conflict, and there still is, in probably every project. But like that's actually not the hardest part, in my opinion. And that's so like Alan's talk talks a lot about that internal communication, um, and that's I'd say that the most important thing that I found from that talk and just from my experience has been like face to face communication, if at all possible, whether that's in person or even like this video calls. Like that can be so powerful. Both again internal with your project, like if you can get people on a video call, if people are comfortable with it and have the bandwidth for it, or if you can meet up occasionally, even if it's once a year, once every couple of years, those experiences stick with you and they help reveal the humans behind the work, right? And so like internally, that's a huge thing. Externally, I think it's cool too. Like if you're collaborating with another open source project, or you want to chat to somebody, or maybe it's a newer contributor, like if you can find a way, if language and technology lets you do it, that face to face communication can be really powerful. That's one of the best takeaways I think I had from that, from Alan's talk specifically. Um, but
I
yeah,
think what
even
I was gonna
yeah,
say,
go
I
ahead.
think what makes internal communication a lot easier is at least in a project, you will have a fundamental agreement on some core concepts. Like in GNOME, for
Mm-hmm.
example, nobody's going to argue we shouldn't use GTK or we shouldn't. Is like the mainly built in like C or C++? I'm actually not sure.
Is
Whatever,
what built in C or C?
like GNOME.
I mean, a lot of languages, but
Yeah,
yes, I would say
sure.
C is the de facto like
Like no,
language for GNOME. But
no
yeah,
one's going to argue like, oh, we should use like this
like
instead. Like
rewrite it
maybe,
all in.
yeah, rewrite it
I
all
mean,
in
although
Rust.
you do get
I,
some people, you do get
sure.
that, right?
Sure. Okay.
But yeah,
GTK
you
is a
do.
good example. No one's
Yeah,
going to argue
yeah.
like it shouldn't be built in GTK.
Right,
Like
right.
you have these like fundamental understandings.
Yeah.
When someone is coming from outside of a project or you're talking like with someone, it's kind of hard to, especially if they're not laid out clearly, make those points understood. And oftentimes someone will get involved in a project and maybe not agree with those fundamentals. And when that's the case, that's when you start to see some of this, I guess, pushback, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like we talked about this last time too, but there's this like, especially if you're a newer contributor, you come in and you have like some wild ideas. You're like, man, nobody's thought of this. Like, I'm just the right person. I have the right idea. Like, they need to rewrite it all in whatever, or they need to redesign everything and do this. Like, it's easy to, from an external perspective, have those ideas. Like, but oftentimes, like you said, the problem isn't necessarily that the actual like technical thing. It's the people interactions, the community interactions, the
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
or the stakeholders. Honestly, a lot of times you don't see the stakeholders that are involved in an open source project. So a good example is GNOME. Obviously, you think I feel like it's a meme at this point that like, oh, GNOME is GTK, is Red Hat, is Fedora, is it's all the same people or
Yeah,
whatever. Is
yeah.
Flatpak. Like you hear
IBM's in
that,
there
right?
somewhere.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and IBM's pulling all the puppet strings from the top, right? And like that's not at all how it works. It's really cool that Red Hat employs a lot of people to work on uh, Fedora and GTK and GNOME and Flatpak and stuff. But like, they're not the ones pulling the strings. They are independent projects for a reason. There are stakeholders from companies like Purism and Endless OS, and I'm sure there's half a dozen others that I can't think of off the top of my head. I mean, Ubuntu, like those are all stakeholders who have a vested interest in the project of GNOME. And like, it's also interesting to think like GNOME doesn't ship a product really, like, and this is kind of changing with like GNOME has an ecosystem. There's apps, there's a set of technologies, but like there's not, I mean, there's a GNOME OS thing which is like mostly for development, but GNOME is not the product itself that most users actually get. They get Ubuntu, or they get Fedora, or they get Red Hat, or they get whatever. And so you don't see the behind the scenes stakeholders who say, like, Ubuntu says, oh, actually we're going to do this, and so we want it to work this way, and then Endless OS says, well, we want it to work this way, and then we've done research that says this. And so you end up with this end product. And so people go like, oh, the GNOME designers just did this and they didn't ask anybody. It's like, no, actually for like years behind the scenes, there were discussions and there were different stakeholder meetings and there was user research. And yeah, sometimes the thing that gets shipped is not like the perfect vision that the design team had or doesn't solve everybody's need perfectly, but it's because it is this collaboration between all these different stakeholders. And I think that's part of open source and like Linux in general that people don't really see often enough. So that's something to keep in mind, I guess, if you're commenting on a design decision or you're wondering why something happened a certain way in your favorite open source project, like there might be these stakeholders they're funding the work. They're the ones who are paying developers to do the work. And they're not like secretly controlling the project, but they're going to work on what makes sense for them. So yeah, it's just something interesting to keep in mind, I think.